Welcome to Sleep Theories. Before we dive into tonight's story, I hope you're having a wonderful day, wherever you are in the world. Whether it's morning coffee time in New York, afternoon tea in London, or late evening wind down in Tokyo, thank you for joining us. If you enjoy these deep dives into the mysteries that keep us awake at night, please consider subscribing to Sleep Theories. Now, let's explore a story that might change how you think about what lies beneath the ice. Date: March 15th, 2023. Location: classified. My name is Daniel Kesler. If you're hearing this, then I'm probably dead or worse. Disappeared like the others who knew what we found down there. I've kept these audio logs hidden for 25 years, but the ice is melting faster now. The world deserves to know what's buried beneath Antarctica before it's too late. This isn't some conspiracy theory cooked up by internet trolls. I was there. I saw it with my own eyes, touched it with my own hands, and I've spent every day since 1998 looking over my shoulder, wondering when they'll come to silence me permanently. They called it Project ECHO9. Officially, it didn't exist. Date: September 12th, 1998. Classification: eyes only. The call came on a Tuesday. I was in my apartment in Arlington, 3 months into civilian life after 22 years mapping terrain for the Army Corps of Engineers. The voice on the phone was crisp, professional, and knew things about my service record that weren't supposed to be in any file. Mr. Kesler, my name is Director Hayes. We have a position that requires your particular expertise in cartographic analysis and cold weather operations. I should have hung up. Should have known that legitimate government contracts don't start with anonymous phone calls to unlisted numbers. But the money they offered, $200,000 for 6 weeks' work, was more than I'd made in 2 years of military pay. What kind of position, I asked. Satellite mapping correction in Antarctica. There are some magnetic anomalies affecting our GPS systems. Nothing more complicated than that. Nothing more complicated. If only I'd known then what I know now. The meeting was set for the next day at a nondescript office building in Tyson's Corner. No company name on the directory, just Suite 1247. Director Hayes turned out to be a thin man in his 50s with the kind of tan that comes from spending time in places the government doesn't officially acknowledge. He wore an expensive suit but cheap shoes, the kind of detail you notice when you've spent 2 decades watching for enemy movement. Before we continue, Mr. Kesler, I need you to sign this preliminary non-disclosure agreement. He slid a thick document across the mahogany table, standard procedure for sensitive contracts. I should have read it more carefully. The NDA wasn't standard at all. It bound me to secrecy about anything I might see, hear, or experience during the mission, with penalties including indefinite detention under national security provisions. But the money was real, and my savings were running low. The mission is straightforward, Hayes continued after I'd signed. You'll be part of a small team conducting geomagnetic surveys near the Gamburtsev Mountains. Our satellites have been getting interference in that region, probably some kind of iron ore deposit throwing off the readings. Your job is to map the anomaly and recommend corrections to our orbital positioning algorithms. He opened a folder containing satellite images of the Antarctic interior. The photos showed nothing but endless white ice, broken only by the dark peaks of the Gamburtsev range, jutting through the frozen surface like ancient teeth. When do we leave? I asked. October 15th. You'll fly into Christchurch, then to McMurdo Station, then helicopter to our forward base, Camp Argus. It's not on any official maps, and it won't be after you leave. That should have been another red flag. Temporary bases in Antarctica required international clearance under the Antarctic Treaty. If Camp Argus wasn't on the maps, it meant someone was going to great lengths to keep it secret. But I signed the contract. God help me, I signed it. Date: March 15th, 2023. The flight to Antarctica was my first hint that this wasn't a routine mapping mission. Instead of the usual military transport filled with scientists and support personnel, our team travelled on an unmarked C-130 Hercules with no identification numbers. Just 13 people, and half of them weren't talking to the other half. Dr. Sarah Chen was the team's archaeologist, which should have been my second red flag since you don't need an archaeologist for satellite calibration. She was young, maybe early 30s, with the intense focus of someone who'd spent years digging up secrets that others wanted to stay buried. When I asked why she was on a mapping mission, she just smiled and said, "Insurance, in case we find something older than expected." Colonel Marcus Webb and General Patricia Morrison were the military contingent. Webb was Army Intelligence, Morrison was Air Force Strategic Command. Neither would tell me why two generals were needed for a GPS correction mission. They spent most of the flight huddled over classified briefings, speaking in code words I didn't recognise. Then there was Dr. James Holbrook, the linguist. That was red flag number 3. Why would we need someone who specialised in ancient languages for a geological survey? The rest of the team was made up of technicians, a medical officer, and 2 men who claimed to be logistics coordinators, but carried themselves like special forces operators. Everything about the mission felt wrong, but by then we were already crossing the Ross Ice Shelf and it was too late to turn back. McMurdo Station was exactly what I expected. A ramshackle collection of prefab buildings and research facilities scattered across the ice like a frontier town. What I didn't expect was how quickly we were shuffled through processing and loaded onto helicopters for the final leg to Camp Argus. The flight took 3 hours over terrain that looked like the surface of an alien world, miles and miles of white nothing, broken only by the occasional crevasse or mountain peak. I'd been to cold places before, Alaska, northern Canada, the Hindu Kush, but Antarctica was different. It wasn't just cold, it was hostile to life in a way that made your bones ache even inside a heated helicopter. Camp Argus sat in a valley between 2 peaks of the Gamburtsev Mountains, sheltered from the worst of the Antarctic winds, but still exposed enough that the temperature never rose above negative 30 degrees Fahrenheit. The base consisted of 6 prefabricated modules connected by enclosed walkways, plus a communications array that looked far more sophisticated than anything needed for routine contact with McMurdo. "Welcome to the end of the world," Colonel Webb said as we unloaded our gear. "You'll find that conventional rules don't apply here. Neither do conventional explanations for what you're about to see." That night, as I set up my equipment in the cartography module, Dr. Chen knocked on my door. "Can I ask you something, Daniel?" She looked nervous, which was unusual for someone who'd spent her career excavating tombs and ancient settlements. "Sure." "In your military experience, have you ever been on a mission where you weren't told the real objective until after you were already committed?" I thought about it. Once or twice. Usually means someone expects heavy casualties and doesn't want people backing out. She nodded grimly. That's what I was afraid of. Date: October 18th, 1998. Classification: Beyond Top Secret. The ground-penetrating radar readings came back on our 3rd day at Camp Argus. I was expecting to see the typical geological formations you'd find under 2 miles of ice. Rock layers, maybe some mineral deposits that could explain the magnetic interference. Instead, the radar showed structures. Not natural rock formations or ice caves. Structures. Geometric patterns that looked like city blocks, arranged in concentric circles around what appeared to be a central plaza or courtyard. The buildings, if they were buildings, were massive, some stretching over 1,000 feet in diameter. "This has to be a equipment malfunction," I told Dr. Chen as we reviewed the data. "There's no way there are structures under this ice. The Gamburtsev Mountains have been buried for millions of years." She was quiet for a long moment, studying the radar images with the intensity of someone solving a puzzle. What if they haven't been buried for millions of years? What if they were built after the ice formed? That's impossible. Nothing could survive under 2 miles of solid ice. "Nothing we know of," she corrected. "But look at this." She pointed to a section of the radar data showing what appeared to be tunnels or passages connecting the structures. "These passages are too regular to be natural. And see these readings here?" She indicated areas where the radar was getting strange returns, almost like the equipment was bouncing signals off something metallic. "That's not ice. That's not rock. That's something else." General Morrison appeared in the doorway of our module. "Dr. Chen, Mr. Kesler, I need you both in the command centre. Now." The command centre was buzzing with activity. Banks of computers displayed data streams I didn't recognise, and several technicians were working frantically to process incoming information. On the main screen was a 3-dimensional model of what lay beneath the ice, based on our radar surveys. It looked like a city. Not just any city, but one designed according to principles I'd never seen before. The streets didn't follow standard grid patterns or organic growth typical of human settlements. Instead, they formed complex geometric shapes, spirals, hexagons, patterns that seemed to shift and change depending on how you looked at them. "Gentleman, lady," General Morrison addressed the room, What you're seeing is why you're really here. 3 weeks ago, thermal imaging from one of our reconnaissance satellites detected heat signatures in this region. Not geological heat, artificial heat in patterns that suggest active systems or processes. Colonel Webb stepped forward with a laser pointer. The structures you're seeing extend approximately 4 miles beneath the ice. Initial analysis suggests they're constructed from some kind of stone we've never encountered before, combined with metal alloys that our spectrographic analysis can't identify. Dr. Holbrook, the linguist, spoke up. General, have you considered the possibility that these structures predate known human civilization? Some of the geometric patterns match Proto-Sumerian mathematical concepts, but with advances that shouldn't have been possible for Bronze Age cultures. We've considered many possibilities, Doctor, Morrison replied. What we need now is access. We're going to drill down to the first level of structures and establish direct contact with whatever's down there. The room fell silent. I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the Antarctic cold. Ma'am, I said carefully, if there are artificial heat signatures and unknown materials down there, shouldn't we be proceeding with extreme caution? We don't know what we're dealing with. General Morrison's expression didn't change. Mr. Kesler, this site was first detected in 1947 during Operation High Jump. The Soviet Union found it again in 1956. The Chinese have been conducting unauthorized surveys here since 1987. We're not the first ones to find this place. We're just the first ones who might actually be able to do something about it. That was the moment I realized I wasn't part of a mapping mission. I was part of something much larger and more dangerous than I could have imagined. Date: March 16th, 2023. The drilling began at dawn on October 20th. They brought in equipment I'd never seen before. Thermal lance systems that could melt through ice at temperatures that should have been impossible to generate in Antarctica. The power requirements alone should have required a small nuclear reactor, but our generators were conventional diesel units. Where did this equipment come from? I asked one of the technicians. He just shrugged. Above my pay grade, buddy. They tell me to operate it. I operate it. The drilling went faster than anyone expected. Instead of the weeks it should have taken to penetrate 2 miles of solid ice, we reached the first structure level in just 4 days. The thermal lances weren't just melting ice, they were cutting through it like it was butter, creating a perfectly cylindrical shaft 8 feet in diameter. Dr. Chen was monitoring the drill progress when she called everyone to the command center. You need to see this, she said, her voice tight with excitement and fear. The drill had broken through into an open space. The cameras mounted on the thermal lance showed a vast chamber, easily 100 feet high, with walls made of the same black stone we'd detected on radar. But the stone wasn't rough or primitive. It was polished to a mirror finish, with surfaces so smooth they seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. My God, Dr. Holbrook whispered, look at the walls. Carved into the black stone were symbols, not random scratches or primitive pictographs, but complex mathematical and linguistic patterns. The symbols seemed to shift and move in the camera light, creating optical illusions that made it difficult to focus on any individual character. Those aren't human, Dr. Chen said quietly. I've studied every known ancient writing system, and this is something else entirely. The mathematical concepts alone suggest a civilization with scientific knowledge far beyond anything we've achieved. General Morrison was already on the satellite phone with someone whose authority clearly exceeded even hers. I caught fragments of the conversation. Confirmed structural integrity, unknown composition, recommend immediate excavation team. But it was Colonel Webb who said what we were all thinking. We're not the first humans to see this place. Someone's been down there before us. He was pointing at something in the far corner of the chamber, equipment that looked decidedly human in origin. Abandoned drilling gear, cables, and what appeared to be scientific instruments, all covered in ice and corrosion. Soviet markings, Webb continued, probably from their 1956 expedition, which means they got further than anyone admitted. That night I couldn't sleep. The implications of what we'd found were staggering. If there really was an ancient civilization buried under Antarctica, one with technology that exceeded our current capabilities, then everything we thought we knew about human history was wrong. But more disturbing was the realization that the world's major powers had known about it for decades and kept it secret. I was reviewing the day's radar data when Dr. Chen knocked on my door again. This time she looked genuinely frightened. "Daniel, I need to show you something, but you have to promise me you won't tell the generals until I figure out what it means." She led me to her module and pulled up a series of photographs she'd taken of the symbols on the chamber walls. Using image enhancement software, she'd been able to isolate individual characters and compare them to known ancient languages. "These symbols," she said, pointing to a sequence of intricate carvings, "they're not just decorative. They're instructions, mathematical formulas, star charts, and something else. Something that looks like a warning." "A warning about what?" She enhanced another image showing a series of symbols arranged in a spiral pattern. "I'm not entirely sure, but based on the mathematical relationships and the astronomical references, I think it's a countdown. A timeline showing when something is supposed to happen." "When?" Dr. Chen's hands were shaking as she brought up her final calculation. "If I'm reading this correctly, the timeline ends in 2023, 25 years from now." The next morning we descended into the chamber. Date: October 25th, 1998. Classification: ultra-classified, Orion clearance. The descent into the chamber required specialized equipment, climbing gear rated for extreme cold, atmospheric monitoring systems, and emergency evacuation protocols that Colonel Webb insisted on personally overseeing. The shaft created by our thermal lances was stable, but the unknown composition of the structures below made it impossible to predict how they might react to human presence. I was part of the first team to reach the bottom, along with Dr. Chen, Dr. Holbrook, and two of the Special Forces operatives who'd finally revealed their true purpose on the mission. They were there to secure anything that might be considered a national security asset. The chamber was even more impressive from ground level. The ceiling soared overhead, supported by pillars that defied conventional engineering principles. The black stone walls curved in impossible ways, creating optical illusions that made it difficult to judge distances or directions. And everywhere, carved into every surface, were the symbols that Dr. Chen had been studying. But it was what we found in the centre of the chamber that changed everything. A sarcophagus, 8 feet long, 3 feet wide, made from the same black stone as the walls, but with a crystalline lid that seemed to glow with its own internal light. The sarcophagus sat on a raised platform surrounded by smaller objects, tablets, instruments, and devices whose purpose we couldn't begin to guess. "Jesus Christ," one of the operatives whispered, "there's something inside it." Through the translucent lid, we could see the outline of a humanoid figure, but it wasn't quite human. The proportions were wrong: too tall, limbs too long, skull elongated in ways that didn't match any known human ethnic group. The figure appeared to be perfectly preserved, as if it had been placed in the sarcophagus yesterday rather than thousands of years ago. Dr. Chen was already photographing everything, her camera flash reflecting off the crystalline surfaces and creating strange patterns of light and shadow. "This is incredible," she murmured. "The preservation is perfect. Whatever process they used, it's maintained cellular integrity far beyond anything we can achieve." Dr. Holbrook was focused on the tablets surrounding the sarcophagus. "These symbols are more complex than anything we saw on the walls," he reported. "It's like they're telling a story, or giving instructions for something." One of the tablets was different from the others. Instead of being carved from stone, it appeared to be made from some kind of crystal that resonated with a low-frequency hum when exposed to our lights. The moment our flashlight beams hit its surface, the entire chamber filled with a sound like whale song, deep and mournful, and somehow intelligent. "Turn off the lights," Dr. Chen shouted, but it was too late. The crystal tablet was now glowing on its own, pulsing with rhythmic patterns that seemed to match the strange acoustics echoing through the chamber. That's when Dr. Holbrook started screaming. He was standing closest to the crystal tablet when it activated, and the effect on him was immediate and terrifying. His eyes rolled back in his head, and he began speaking in a language none of us recognized. Guttural sounds mixed with mathematical concepts that shouldn't have been possible for a human voice to produce. "They knew," he said in English, his voice distorted and echoing strangely in the chamber. "They knew it would happen again. The ice, the water, the awakening. That's why they buried it. That's why they left the warnings." Colonel Webb was already on his radio calling for immediate evacuation, but Dr. Holbrook wasn't finished. "The countdown isn't to destruction," he continued, his voice becoming more inhuman with each word. "It's to emergence. When the ice melts enough, when the barriers weaken, they'll return, and we won't be ready. Then he collapsed, and we never heard him speak coherently again. The evacuation from the chamber was chaotic. Dr. Holbrook was unconscious but still muttering in that inhuman language, and the crystal tablet continued to pulse with increasing intensity. Worse, the sarcophagus itself was beginning to respond to the tablet's activation, its crystalline lid glowing brighter, and the preservation systems inside making sounds like machinery powering up after centuries of dormancy. We were halfway up the shaft when the seismic alarm started going off. Date: March 16th, 2023. The earthquakes weren't natural. I've been in enough natural disasters to know the difference between tectonic activity and something artificial. These tremors were rhythmic, purposeful, like the heartbeat of something enormous waking up deep beneath the ice. Back at Camp Argus, the seismic monitoring equipment was going crazy. The tremors were originating from directly below the chamber we'd just evacuated, but they were spreading outward in patterns that defied geological explanation. It was as if our presence in the chamber had triggered some kind of activation sequence in the structures below. Dr. Holbrook was in the medical module, sedated but still occasionally muttering in that strange language. Our medical officer, Dr. Patricia Vance, was baffled by his condition. "His brain activity is off the charts," she reported to General Morrison. "It's like he's processing information at 10 times normal human capacity, but the strain is causing severe neurological damage. If this continues, he'll suffer permanent brain damage or death within hours." General Morrison's response was immediate and chilling. "Then we better get what information we can before that happens. They brought in recording equipment and tried to document everything, Doctor," Holbrook was saying, but most of it was incomprehensible. However, Dr. Chen had been working on translating some of the simpler phrases, and what she found was disturbing. "He keeps mentioning dates," she told me privately. "Specific years that correspond to major climate events, ice ages, global warming periods, massive geological changes, and he keeps saying they return when the barriers fall. Who returns? I don't know, but whatever or whoever they are, according to Holbrook's translations, they've been here before, multiple times throughout Earth's history, and each return corresponds to a major extinction event. That night, Dr. Holbrook died. Officially, the cause was listed as acute hypothermia complicated by altitude sickness. But I was there when it happened. His final words were in perfect English. The Piri Reis map was right. They drew Antarctica without ice because they remembered when it was green, before the last awakening. The Piri Reis map. I'd heard of it, a 1513 map that supposedly showed the coastline of Antarctica centuries before the continent was officially discovered, and depicted it without ice cover. Most historians dismissed it as either a hoax or a lucky guess, but Dr. Holbrook seemed to be suggesting something else entirely. The morning after Holbrook's death, I made a discovery that changed my understanding of everything we'd found. I was reviewing the satellite data from our mission when I noticed something odd about the thermal signatures we detected. The heat sources weren't random, they formed a pattern, a very specific pattern that I recognised from my years of military cartography. It was a map. The thermal signatures, viewed from above, formed the outline of every major continent on Earth. But not as they exist today, as they existed millions of years ago, during the Pangaea supercontinent period. The structures beneath the ice weren't just a buried city, they were a representation of Earth's entire geological history, preserved in stone and metal by a civilization that had been observing our planet's changes for far longer than human history. I tried to share this discovery with Dr. Chen, but when I went to her module I found it empty. Her equipment was gone, her research notes were missing, and there was no sign of struggle. She had simply vanished. Colonel Webb's explanation was brief and unsatisfying. Dr. Chen was evacuated due to medical emergency during the night. All expedition members are subject to immediate relocation for health and safety reasons. But I knew better. Dr. Chen had gotten too close to the truth, and someone had decided she needed to disappear. That afternoon, General Morrison called a meeting of all remaining personnel. The message was simple. The mission was being terminated due to equipment failures and adverse weather conditions. We would be evacuated within 24 hours, and all materials and data from the expedition would be classified at the highest levels of national security. Furthermore, Morrison continued, all personnel will be required to undergo extensive debriefing and sign additional non-disclosure agreements. any attempt to discuss or publish information about this mission will be considered an act of treason against the United States. I knew then that I was never going to see the outside world the same way again, if I saw it at all. Date: October 28th, 1998. Classification: Beyond Black. Eyes only Orion. Before our evacuation, I managed to access the classified files that General Morrison thought were beyond my clearance level. 22 years of military intelligence work teaches you how to find information that people don't want you to find. What I discovered was that Project Echo 9 wasn't the first mission to this site. It wasn't even the second or third. The US government had been aware of the structures beneath the Gamburtsev Mountains since 1947, when Admiral Richard Byrd's Operation High Jump discovered them during what was officially described as a training exercise in Antarctic warfare. But Byrd's mission logs, buried in classified Navy archives, told a very different story. Operation High Jump had originally been planned as a 6-month expedition, with 4,700 personnel and extensive military equipment. Instead, it was terminated after just 8 weeks, with Byrd reporting hostile action that resulted in significant casualties and the loss of several aircraft. Byrd's final report, classified for over 50 years, contained a single line that explained everything. It is necessary for the USA to take defensive actions against enemy fighters which come from the polar regions. Enemy fighters, in 1947, from the polar regions. The Soviet files were even more revealing. In 1956, during the height of the Cold War, a joint Soviet-American expedition had reached the buried structures and managed to penetrate several levels deeper than our 1998 mission. The results were catastrophic. Of the 47 personnel who descended into the lower levels, only 12 returned to the surface. The survivors were placed in psychiatric institutions and never spoke publicly about what they'd seen. But one of them, a Soviet geologist named Dr. Alexei Volkov, had managed to smuggle out a single photograph before his disappearance. The photograph showed the same type of sarcophagus we'd found, but opened, with the elongated humanoid figure sitting upright and apparently alive. The most disturbing file was labelled Historical Correlations, Ancient Cartography. It contained detailed analysis of the Piri Reis map and dozens of other ancient maps and documents that depicted Antarctica without ice cover. The conclusion was inescapable. Multiple civilizations throughout history had known about the structures beneath the ice, and some had even been in contact with whatever was down there. The ancient Sumerians had texts describing watchers from the southern ice, who brought knowledge of mathematics and astronomy. The Mayans had prophecies about the return of the Ice Lords that were supposed to occur when the Great Ice melted. Even the Egyptian pyramids were oriented according to astronomical calculations that included precise measurements of Antarctica's position and topology. The conspiracy wasn't just about hiding an archaeological discovery. It was about concealing the fact that human civilization had been influenced, guided, or controlled by non-human intelligence for thousands of years, and that intelligence was now waking up as global warming melted the barriers that had kept it imprisoned. The final file in the classified archive was a climate projection study commissioned by the Pentagon in 1987. The study predicted that Antarctic ice melt would reach critical levels sometime between 2020 and 2030, with catastrophic consequences for global sea levels and weather patterns. But buried in the technical data was a single line that revealed the real concern. Thermal barrier integrity will be compromised by 2025, allowing activation of subsurface systems. They knew, the government, the military, the intelligence agencies, they all knew that climate change wasn't just going to flood coastal cities and disrupt weather patterns. It was going to wake up something that had been sleeping under the ice for millennia, and they were doing nothing to stop it. Date: March 17th, 2023. The evacuation from Camp Argus was the most terrifying experience of my life, and I'd been shot at by enemy forces in 3 different countries. It wasn't the helicopter ride through an Antarctic storm or the mechanical problems that nearly crashed us into the Ross Ice Shelf. It was the realization that I was never going to be allowed to tell anyone what I'd seen. The debriefing took place at McMurdo Station, in a prefabricated building that wasn't on any of the base maps. For 6 days I was interrogated by intelligence officers from agencies I didn't recognise, using techniques that were definitely not part of any official manual. They wanted to know every detail of what I'd observed, every conversation I'd had with other team members, every photograph I'd taken or document I'd seen. But they weren't trying to gather information. They were trying to determine how much I knew and whether I posed a security risk. On the 7th day, they brought in a man who introduced himself only as Mr. Grey. He was older, maybe in his 60s, with a kind of weathered face that comes from decades of outdoor work in harsh conditions. His credentials identified him as being from the Department of Energy, but everything about his manner suggested military intelligence or something even more shadowy. "Mr. Kesler," he said, settling into the chair across from me in the windowless interrogation room. "You've seen things that most people aren't equipped to understand. Things that could cause widespread panic if they became public knowledge." "You mean the structures under the ice?" He smiled, but it wasn't a pleasant expression. "I mean the implications of those structures. Do you understand what would happen if the world learned that human civilization has been guided by non-human intelligence for thousands of years? If people discovered that their religions, their governments, their entire understanding of history was based on lies?" I thought about it. "There would be chaos. There would be the end of civilization as we know it," he corrected, "which is why certain information must remain classified, regardless of the personal cost to those who possess it." He slid a document across the table. It was thicker than the original NDA I'd signed, with legal language that basically signed away my right to ever speak about the mission or its discoveries. The penalties for violation included life imprisonment without possibility of parole. "What about the other team members?" I asked. "Dr. Chen, the technicians, the other personnel?" Mr. Gray's expression didn't change. "Dr. Chen suffered an unfortunate accident during her return journey to the United States. The technicians have been reassigned to other projects where their specialized knowledge can be properly utilized. You're the only one with comprehensive knowledge of the entire mission." "You're saying I'm the only witness left?" "I'm saying you're the only person still alive who has the complete picture of what Project Echo 9 discovered." The implication was clear. Sign the document and keep silent, or join Dr. Chen and the others who had suffered unfortunate accidents. I signed. But signing the document didn't end my involvement with the Antarctic discovery. Over the next several years, I was contacted periodically by government representatives who wanted updates on my psychological adjustment to the classified material I'd been exposed to. The contacts were always brief and professional, but the message was clear. They were watching me. In 2003, I was approached by a journalist named Michael Harrison, who was investigating rumours about classified Antarctic expeditions. Harrison had somehow obtained partial information about Operation High Jump and the Soviet expeditions, and he was trying to piece together the full story. He contacted me because my name appeared on some of the declassified personnel lists from McMurdo Station. I told him I couldn't help him, but Harrison was persistent. He kept calling, sending emails, even showing up at my apartment with questions about things he couldn't possibly have known unless he had inside information. Finally, I agreed to meet him at a coffee shop in downtown Arlington, intending to convince him to drop his investigation for his own safety. Harrison never showed up for the meeting. The next day, his body was found in the Potomac River. The official cause of death was accidental drowning, but Harrison was an experienced swimmer and former Navy SEAL. The story made local news for exactly 1 day before disappearing entirely. After Harrison's death, I realized that simply staying quiet wasn't enough to guarantee my safety. The people controlling information about the Antarctic discoveries were willing to kill to maintain their secrets, and my continued existence was only tolerated as long as I remained completely silent. So I developed a different strategy. Instead of trying to expose the truth directly, I began documenting everything I could remember about Project Echo 9 and storing the information in multiple secure locations. If something happened to me, the documents would eventually be released. If I lived long enough, maybe I could find a way to get the information out without getting myself killed. 25 years later, I'm still alive, but the world is running out of time. Date, March 18th, 2023. The ice is melting faster than anyone predicted. I've been monitoring Antarctic climate data for 2 decades, and the acceleration over the past 5 years is unprecedented. The West Antarctic ice sheet is losing mass at a rate that suggests complete collapse within the next decade, and the East Antarctic ice sheet, where the Gamburtsev Mountains are located, is showing signs of instability that weren't predicted by any climate models. But the most disturbing development isn't the ice melt itself, it's the seismic activity. Since 2018, the Gamburtsev mountain region has experienced over 300 earthquakes of magnitude 4.0 or higher. That's more seismic activity than the region had experienced in the previous 50 years combined. The earthquake patterns are exactly what you'd expect if massive structures were shifting or activating beneath the ice. The thermal signatures are changing too. Satellite data shows that the heat sources we detected in 1998 have increased in intensity by over 400%. Whatever technology or systems are buried under those mountains, they're becoming more active as the ice above them thins. But here's what really scares me. The government knows all of this, and they're not just hiding it. They're actively preventing any research or investigation into the region. The Gamburtsev Mountains are now completely off limits to all scientific expeditions, with a restricted airspace designation that allows military aircraft to shoot down any unauthorized flights. Official explanation: environmental protection protocols. Meanwhile, strange things are happening around the world that correlate with the increased Antarctic activity. Marine biologists are reporting massive die-offs of deep-sea creatures, as if something is disturbing the ocean depths. Astronomers are detecting radio signals from the direction of Antarctica that don't match any known natural phenomena, and there have been at least 12 reported UFO sightings in the Southern Ocean since 2020, all from commercial pilots who were later pressured to retract their statements. I've tried reaching out to other survivors from the various Antarctic expeditions over the years, but most are either dead, missing, or too terrified to speak. However, in 2019 I managed to make contact with Dr. Elena Vasquez, a geologist who was part of a Chilean expedition that encountered anomalous structures in 2007. Her team was evacuated after only 3 days, and she spent 2 years in psychiatric treatment for what officials described as severe altitude psychosis. But Dr. Vasquez wasn't psychotic. She was traumatized by what she'd seen. We met in secret at a small cafe in Santiago, and she told me about her team's discovery of an entrance to the underground structures, not the shaft we'd drilled, but a natural opening that had been revealed by recent ice melt. Her team had descended only about 50 feet before encountering active technology. Lights that turned on as they approached, symbols that glowed and shifted on the walls, and sounds that she described as mechanical but alive. "They're waking up," she told me, her hands shaking as she spoke. "Whatever's down there, it's been dormant for thousands of years, but the ice melt is triggering activation sequences. We're not just dealing with archaeological ruins, we're dealing with functional technology that's responding to environmental changes." Dr. Vasquez also told me something that connected directly to Dr. Holbrook's final words. She had managed to photograph some of the symbols her team encountered, and when she showed them to a colleague who specialized in ancient cartography, he immediately recognized similarities to the Peary Race map and other historical documents that depicted Antarctica without ice. "The symbols aren't just decorative," she explained. "They're coordinates, star charts and geographical references that show Earth as it existed during different geological periods. But more than that, they show Earth as it will exist in the future, when the ice caps melt completely." The implications were staggering. The intelligence buried under Antarctica hadn't just observed Earth's geological changes over millions of years, it had predicted them. Climate change wasn't an accidental byproduct of human industrial activity. It was part of a cycle that had been planned and anticipated by non-human intelligence long before humans even existed. Dr. Vasquez died in a car accident 6 months after our meeting. The brake lines on her vehicle had been cut. Date: present-day analysis. March 2023. Classification: Personal Archive. D. Kesler. As I compile these logs in 2023, the evidence suggests that we're approaching the final phase of whatever cycle the Antarctic intelligence has been orchestrating. The thermal signatures beneath the Gamburtsev Mountains now extend over 1,000 square mile area, indicating that the underground structures are far more extensive than we realized in 1998. But more disturbing is the discovery that similar thermal signatures are appearing at other locations around the world, all in regions that were once covered by ice sheets during previous geological periods. Northern Canada, Siberia, Greenland, and even sections of the Sahara Desert that were frozen during ice ages are showing unexplained heat sources and seismic activity. The network is global. Whatever we found in Antarctica isn't isolated. It's part of a worldwide system that has been monitoring and influencing Earth's climate for millions of years. Recent satellite data shows that these global heat sources are synchronizing their activity. The thermal pulses from Antarctica are being matched by similar pulses from sites in Alaska, northern Russia, and beneath the Greenland ice sheet. It's as if a communication network is activating, preparing for something that requires coordination across the entire planet. The timeline Dr. Chen translated from the chamber symbols, ending in 2023, wasn't predicting destruction. It was predicting emergence. 3 weeks ago, I received a package with no return address. Inside was a single photograph taken by what appeared to be a deep-sea submersible. The image showed the ocean floor near Antarctica, but instead of the usual rocky terrain, there were structures, the same black stone construction we'd found beneath the ice. But these were on the ocean floor and clearly active. Lights were visible within the structures, and the water around them was filled with what looked like geometric patterns of bioluminescence. Attached to the photograph was a note in handwriting I didn't recognise. They're not waking up. They're coming home. Yesterday, news reports began appearing about unexplained sonar contacts in the Southern Ocean. Ships from multiple nations are reporting large, fast-moving objects beneath the ice that don't match any known marine life or human technology. The official explanation is previously unknown whale species disturbed by climate change. But I know better. The countdown is over. The barriers have fallen, and after 25 years of silence, it's time for the world to know what's really happening. Date: March 19th, 2023. This will be my final audio log. As I record this, there are unmarked vehicles parked outside my apartment, and I know my time is running out. But the information I've documented over the past 25 years is already in the hands of people who can't be silenced as easily as one old cartographer. The truth about Antarctica, about the intelligence that has been guiding human civilization for millennia, about the climate changes that are part of a planned cycle, rather than accidental consequences. All of this information will be released regardless of what happens to me. But there's one final piece of the puzzle that I've only recently understood, and it changes everything. The intelligence buried under Antarctica isn't alien, it's terrestrial. It's from Earth, but from a version of Earth that existed long before humans evolved. The elongated skulls, the advanced technology, the global monitoring network. It all belongs to a species that achieved technological civilization millions of years ago, before the ice ages that buried their cities and forced them into hibernation. They're not invaders, they're the original inhabitants of this planet, and they're waking up to reclaim what was always theirs. The climate change we're experiencing isn't being caused by their technology, it's being caused by us, and their systems are simply responding to the environmental changes by activating emergence protocols that have been dormant for geological ages. Humanity has had its time on Earth. We've had our chance to develop wisdom along with our technology, to prove that we could be responsible stewards of the planet they once ruled. The melting ice isn't just revealing their cities, it's revealing our failure. Dr. Holbrook was right about one thing. We won't be ready for their return. Not because they're hostile, but because our entire civilization is built on assumptions about human supremacy and planetary ownership that are about to be proven catastrophically wrong. The structures beneath Antarctica aren't ruins. They're not even archaeological sites. They're infrastructure, maintained in hibernation for millions of years, waiting for the planetary conditions to become suitable for reactivation. The Piri Reis map was accurate because it was drawn by people who had access to the historical records kept by the Antarctic intelligence. Every ancient civilization that achieved sufficient sophistication was contacted and guided by the sleeping guardians beneath the ice. The knowledge that built the pyramids, that enabled the mathematical achievements of the Mayans, that inspired the astronomical precision of Stonehenge, all of it came from the same source, and now the source is awakening. I can hear vehicles stopping outside my building, multiple engines, coordinated movement, professional voices using radio protocols I recognise from my military days. They've found me, which means they've probably found the documentation sites as well. But it doesn't matter anymore. The ice is melting too fast for them to stop what's coming. The thermal signatures are too widespread, the seismic activity too intense, the global network too thoroughly activated. Within the next 5 years, possibly sooner, the world will witness the emergence of a technological civilization that makes our greatest achievements look like Stone Age tools. Whether humanity survives that emergence will depend on whether we can adapt to being the junior species on a planet that was never really ours to begin with. They're at my door now. I can hear them in the hallway, speaking in the clipped professional tones of People who are very good at making problems disappear. I'm not afraid. 25 years of carrying this secret has been its own kind of prison, and knowing that the truth will finally come out, one way or another, is almost a relief. To whoever finds these recordings, the countdown is over, the barriers have fallen, the real history of Earth is about to begin. This is Daniel Kesler, former military cartographer, survivor of Project Echo 9, signing off. Audio recording ends at 23:47:12 GMT, March 19th, 2023. Device found in apartment 2C, 1247 Arlington Boulevard, following disappearance of resident Daniel Kesler. Subject's whereabouts remain unknown. All materials related to this case are classified under National Security Directive 7741-Omega. Agent Morrison, DHS Special Activities Division. Date: June 15th, 2025. Source: anonymous data dump on multiple file-sharing platforms. The files attributed to Daniel Kesler appeared simultaneously on over 200 websites worldwide on June 15th, 2025, exactly 27 months after his disappearance. Despite immediate efforts by government agencies to remove the materials, the files had been downloaded millions of times within the first 24 hours of their release. Accompanying the audio logs and mission files was a collection of satellite imagery, seismic data, and classified documents that supported Kesler's claims about Antarctic activity. Independent verification of the satellite data confirmed massive thermal signatures beneath the Gamburtsev Mountains, as well as similar signatures at locations in Alaska, Siberia, and Greenland. Of particular note was a series of photographs taken by deep-sea research vessels showing structures on the Antarctic ocean floor that matched descriptions in Kesler's files. The photographs appeared to have been taken over a period of several years, showing the gradual activation of lights and systems within the underwater structures. Perhaps most disturbing was the final document in the data dump, a climate projection study showing accelerated ice melt rates that would expose significant portions of the Antarctic structures within the next 3 years. As of the publication of these files, 17 commercial pilots have reported encounters with unidentified objects emerging from the Southern Ocean. Marine biologists have documented the appearance of previously unknown species of deep-sea life, exhibiting bioluminescent patterns that match the geometric designs described in ancient texts. And seismic monitoring stations around the world have recorded synchronized vibrations originating from former Ice Age regions, as if a global network of some kind is becoming active after millions of years of dormancy. Government officials from multiple nations have declined to comment on the Kesler files, citing national security concerns. However, recently declassified documents from the 1940s and 1950s confirm that both Operation High Jump and subsequent Soviet expeditions did encounter anomalous phenomena in Antarctica that resulted in mission terminations and classified reports. Whether Daniel Kesler's account represents truth or elaborate fiction may become irrelevant in the coming years. The ice continues to melt at unprecedented rates, and the thermal signatures beneath Antarctica continue to intensify. As Kesler predicted in his final audio log, the countdown is over, the barriers are falling, and humanity may soon discover that we are not alone on this planet, and never have been. The real question is not whether the intelligence beneath the ice is awakening, but whether humanity is prepared for what comes next. Recovered journal entry, classification redacted. Subject: Eli Granger, independent journalist. Date range: July 15th to 18th, 2023. Location: Bohemian Grove, Monte Rio, California. The following document was recovered from an encrypted server farm in Iceland. The journalist's current whereabouts remain unknown. Ed. My name is Eli Granger. and I'm writing this because I may not live long enough to tell it in person. What I witnessed in the redwoods of Northern California will haunt me until my dying day, whenever that may come. It started 3 weeks ago with an email that shouldn't have existed. I was in my cramped Oakland apartment, nursing my third cup of coffee and scrolling through encrypted channels where whistleblowers sometimes surface. My secure inbox pinged. A message from an address that was just a string of numbers and letters routed through 7 different proxy servers. No subject line, just an attachment and 4 lines of text. You want truth? Go to the redwoods. Bring a black suit and a quiet soul. July 15th to 18th. The fire reveals all. The attachment was a high-resolution scan of what appeared to be a guest registry for the Bohemian Grove. That mysterious all-male retreat where the world's most powerful men allegedly gather each summer to commune with nature. I'd written about the Grove before, relying on second-hand accounts and leaked photographs from the 1980s. But this was different. The names on the list made my blood run cold. Former presidents, current senators, military contractors whose companies I'd been investigating for years, CEOs of tech giants, pharmaceutical corporations, defense contractors, media moguls who controlled the narrative of entire nations, all scheduled to attend something called the Midsummer Encampment. At the bottom of the scan was a forged access pass with my photograph, a professional headshot I'd never sent to anyone, digitally altered to show me in a black suit and tie. The name read Edmund Gray, Logistics Consultant, Prometheus Industries. Someone with serious resources wanted me inside that grove. The question was why? I should have walked away, should have deleted the email and gone back to writing about municipal corruption and corporate tax avoidance. Safe stories. Stories that didn't get journalists killed. Instead, I packed a black suit and drove north to Sonoma County. The road to Monte Rio winds through some of the most beautiful country in California. Ancient redwoods tower over narrow highways, their canopy so thick that midday feels like twilight. It's the kind of place where you'd expect to find hippie communes and organic wineries, not shadowy cabals plotting the fate of nations. But as I learned in my Navy intelligence days, the most dangerous secrets are always hidden in the most innocent places. I parked at a motel in Gurneyville and walked the perimeter of the Bohemian Grove property that evening. 2,000 acres of private forest, surrounded by chain-link fence topped with razor wire. Security cameras every 50 feet, motion sensors in the trees, the kind of setup you'd expect around a military installation, not a summer camp for rich men. The main gate was staffed by guards who looked more like special forces operators than private security. Black uniforms, tactical gear, the flat stare of men who'd killed before and wouldn't hesitate to do it again. Whatever happened inside those redwoods, they were serious about keeping it secret. The forged pass worked perfectly, too perfectly. The guards scanned the barcode, checked my face against the photo, and waved me through without a second glance. Either the forger was a genius, or someone very powerful wanted me inside. Neither possibility was comforting. The grove itself was exactly as described in the leaked accounts I'd read. Massive redwood trees, some over 1,000 years old, stretched toward a canopy so thick it blocked out the sun. Gravel paths wound between rustic cabins and open-air lodges, each marked with whimsical names: Owl's Nest, Dragon's Den, Caveman's Lodge. It would have been charming if not for the underlying sense of wrongness that permeated everything. The other guests, I couldn't think of them as normal people, not after seeing that registry, moved through this camp with the easy confidence of men accustomed to absolute power. They wore casual clothes during the day, khakis, polo shirts, boat shoes, the uniform of American aristocracy. But their conversations, caught in fragments as I passed, revealed the true scope of their influence. The Shanghai Index will drop exactly 17%. Tell the secretary that Operation Nightfall is greenlit for October. Media blackout should hold for at least 72 hours. I posed as a logistics consultant, which gave me an excuse to wander the grounds with a clipboard and camera phone, confiscated at the gate and replaced with an approved device that couldn't access external networks. The cover story worked well enough. Rich men are accustomed to being served by invisible people who handle the mundane details of their lives. But as the day wore on, I began to notice the symbols. Owls everywhere, carved into tree trunks, etched on building facades, worked into the designs of benches and lampposts. Not cute, friendly owls. These were stylized, angular, with eyes that seemed to follow you as you walked past. The largest was a 40-foot stone statue positioned on a small island in an artificial lake at the heart of the grove. Even in daylight, it radiated a sense of ancient malevolence. Beautiful, isn't it? I turned to find a man in his 70s watching me stare at the giant owl. Silver hair, expensive casual wear, the kind of artificial tan that comes from winters in Palm Beach. His eyes were the palest blue I'd ever seen, almost colourless. The Owl of Bohemia, he continued, joining me at the lake's edge. Been watching over this place for over a century. Some say it's just decorative, others know better. Know better how? I asked, immediately regretting the question. I was supposed to be invisible, unremarkable. The old man smiled, revealing teeth too white and too perfect for his age. You'll see tonight, Mr. Grey. The cremation of care waits for no man, not even consultants. He walked away before I could respond, leaving me staring at the owl statue and wondering how much my cover had already been blown. That evening, as twilight settled over the grove, the atmosphere changed completely. The casual bonhomie of the day disappeared, replaced by something far more serious and ritualistic. Men emerged from their cabins wearing dark robes with hoods that obscured their faces. Some carried torches, others strange ceremonial objects I couldn't identify. I found a dark robe hanging in my assigned cabin, along with a note. Attendance is mandatory. Silence is sacred. The owl sees all. What I witnessed that night will stay with me forever. As darkness fell, hundreds of robed figures processed through the forest paths, converging on the lake where the great owl statue loomed. Torches flickered between the trees like malevolent fireflies. The only sounds were footsteps on gravel and the whisper of fabric against bark. I followed the crowd, keeping my head down and my hood up. The robe smelled of incense and something else, something organic and unpleasant that I couldn't identify. We gathered in a natural amphitheatre around the lake. The owl statue dominated the scene, its eyes seeming to glow red in the torchlight. A wooden boat had been prepared at the water's edge, and in it lay what appeared to be the effigy of a child, small, wrapped in white cloth, disturbingly lifelike. But as I stared at the bundle, a horrible doubt crept into my mind. The proportions were too perfect, the weight distribution too natural. The way the cloth clung to what lay beneath suggested something more substantial than straw and sawdust. A figure in an elaborate robe stepped onto a platform beside the owl. Even with his face hidden, I recognised the bearing and voice of a man who'd been on television every night for years. A former president whose policies had shaped a generation. Brothers of the Grove, his voice boomed across the water, amplified by hidden speakers. We gather once again beneath the ancient eyes of wisdom to perform the sacred rite that frees us from the burdens of conscience. The crowd responded in unison. We banish care and cast it to the flames. Care, that pale and common thing that binds the hands of power. Care that whispers doubt in the ears of decision. Care that stays the sword of necessary action. We banish care and cast it to the flames. The ritualized call and response continued for nearly an hour. Invocations to ancient deities whose names I recognized from my study of Middle Eastern mythology. Moloch, the Carthaginian god of child sacrifice. Enlil, the Mesopotamian lord of wind and authority. Names that shouldn't have been spoken by American leaders in the 21st century. But the most disturbing element wasn't the pagan imagery, or even the suggestions of child sacrifice. It was the casual way these men, titans of industry, shapers of policy, guardians of democracy, participated in rituals that explicitly celebrated the abandonment of human compassion. The ceremony reached its climax when the boat carrying the effigy was pushed out onto the lake. Flames erupted from the water around it, hidden gas jets, I realised, creating the illusion of supernatural fire. The figure in the boat burned quickly, the white cloth falling away to reveal I still can't be certain what I saw. In the flickering light, with smoke obscuring my vision and my mind reeling from the horror of it all, it might have been an elaborately constructed mannequin. The realistic movement could have been caused by the flames consuming internal supports. The sounds, brief, high-pitched, quickly cut off, might have been air escaping from burning materials. But the way some of the robed figures wept as the fire consumed its offering, the way others cheered with genuine ecstasy, suggested something far more sinister than theatrical pageantry. As the flames died down, the crowd began to disperse. I started to follow them back toward the cabins, but a hand fell on my shoulder. Mr. Gray. It was the old man from earlier, still wearing his ceremonial robes. You're invited to the inner circle gathering, a rare honour for a consultant. Before I could refuse, 2 other figures flanked me. Not threatening exactly, but their presence made it clear that declining wasn't an option. They led me deeper into the forest, away from the main paths, to a clearing I hadn't seen during my earlier reconnaissance. Here, perhaps 30 men stood in a circle around a fire pit carved directly into the bedrock. Unlike the theatrical grandeur of the main ceremony, this felt ancient and deadly serious. The inner circle ritual began at midnight. The participants had exchanged their dark robes for masks of polished bone, owl faces with hollow eye sockets that seemed to bore into your soul. They moved with practiced precision, suggesting this ceremony had been performed countless times before. The man who'd led the earlier ritual stepped into the centre of the circle. Without his presidential bearing and familiar voice, he seemed diminished, just another acolyte serving powers older than nations. "Brothers of the Inner Grove," he intoned, "we gather to receive the wisdom of the Ancient Ones, and to consecrate the plans that will shape the world's destiny." The response came in a language I didn't recognise at first, harsh consonants and guttural vowels that seemed to bypass the conscious mind and speak directly to something primal and terrified in the human psyche. But as my Navy intelligence training kicked in, I began to parse familiar elements. This was Akkadian, the ancient language of Mesopotamia, dead for over 2,000 years. They were chanting the names of forgotten gods and promising them sacrifices of nations. Symbols were drawn in the ash around the fire pit, not random occult doodles, but specific sigils I recognised from declassified CIA documents. Project MK Ultra had experimented with ritualistic programming, using ancient symbols and dead languages to bypass conscious resistance in human subjects. The research had supposedly been discontinued in the 1970s. Apparently it had just moved to a more exclusive venue. The ceremony continued for hours. Maps were produced and spread on the ground, not of geographical territories, but of economic zones, resource deposits, population centres. Plans were discussed in mixture of English and Akkadian, but the intent was clear enough. Wars to be started, governments to be toppled, populations to be controlled. And through it all, the participants spoke of themselves not as American leaders serving American interests, but as servants of the Ancient Ones, preparing the world for some greater transformation. "The harvest approaches," one masked figure intoned. "The sleepers must be awakened. The old seals must be broken." "In the name of those who wait in the deep places," the circle responded, "let the work continue." I crouched in the shadows beyond the firelight, recording everything on a digital audio device I'd hidden in my shoe. But as the night wore on, I began to understand that what I was witnessing wasn't just corruption or conspiracy in any conventional sense. These men genuinely believed they were serving inhuman masters. Whether those masters were real or imagined didn't matter. The policies they were planning would affect millions of lives based on the whims of entities that viewed humanity as livestock. The ritual concluded with each participant drinking from a silver chalice and making individual pledges. The liquid looked black in the firelight, and several men convulsed briefly after drinking, their eyes rolling back to show only white. As dawn approached, the circle dissolved. The participants removed their masks, revealed themselves to be exactly who I'd suspected. Former presidents, current senators, military leaders, corporate titans. They shook hands and exchanged quiet words like businessmen concluding a profitable meeting, which in a sense they were. I made it back to my cabin as the first light filtered through the redwood canopy, but I knew I couldn't stay much longer. Whatever protection my forged identity provided was wearing thin. Too many meaningful looks, too many knowing smiles. They were playing with me, letting me see just enough to understand the scope of what I'd stumbled into. But there was one more place I needed to investigate before I could flee. The lodge marked Styx, access by code only, sat apart from the main camp, connected by a service road that didn't appear on any of the maps provided to guests. I'd noticed it during my first day's reconnaissance, but hadn't found an opportunity to investigate. The building itself was unremarkable. Standard wooden construction that matched the other lodges, designed to blend into the forest environment. But the security was anything but standard. Biometric scanners, electromagnetic locks, motion sensors that could detect a heartbeat from 50 feet away. Fortunately, my anonymous benefactor had provided more than just a forged access pass. Hidden in the lining of my suit jacket was a USB device that looked like a standard thumb drive, but contained sophisticated hacking tools developed by someone with serious technical skills. When plugged into the lodge's security system, it created a temporary blind spot in the sensors and provided the access codes needed to bypass the locks. Whoever wanted me to see what lay inside had planned this infiltration down to the smallest detail. The lodge's interior was a facade. Behind a false wall accessed by yet another hidden panel, stairs led down into the bedrock beneath the forest. The passage was older than the buildings above, carved stone rather than modern construction, lit by electric fixtures that had been retrofitted into ancient sconces. At the bottom of the stairs, a heavy oak door opened onto a chamber that took my breath away. The room stretched far beyond what should have been possible given the lodge's footprint above. Stone shelves lined the walls, filled with leather-bound journals, rolled documents, and artefacts that seemed to span centuries. At the centre of the chamber stood a massive table carved from a single piece of black stone, its surface covered with maps, blueprints, and what appeared to be governmental documents bearing official seals. I started with the journals, selecting one at random from a shelf marked 1923 to 1945. The handwriting was elegant, old-fashioned, but the contents were anything but quaint. The European situation proceeds according to plan. Our associates in Berlin understand their role, though they believe themselves to be serving the fatherland rather than the ancient ones. The sacrifice of the lesser peoples will provide the spiritual energy necessary for the next phase of the great work. Another journal, this one more recent. Operation Mockingbird exceeds all expectations. The media outlets respond to our guidance without question, believing they serve journalistic integrity, while actually perpetuating the narratives required for population control. The sleeping masses accept whatever reality we provide. But it was the documents on the central table that truly shattered my understanding of how the world worked. Blueprints for the USA Patriot Act dated 6 months before September 11th, 2001. Battle plans for the invasion of Iraq, complete with fabricated intelligence reports about weapons of mass destruction. Early drafts of social media algorithms designed not to connect people, but to divide them into manageable, controllable factions. And newer documents that made my blood run cold. Plans for a global pandemic response that prioritized control over public health. Blueprints for digital currency systems that would eliminate financial privacy entirely. Population reduction strategies disguised as environmental initiatives. The most disturbing document was a roster of participants going back to the 1870s, when the Bohemian Club was first founded. Names I recognised from history textbooks, titans of the Gilded Age who'd shaped America's industrial development. But also names that shouldn't have been there. Figures from much earlier periods, some dating back centuries. Either the record keeping was fantastically inaccurate, or some of these participants weren't entirely human. At the bottom of the most recent page, a note in fresh handwriting. E. Granger, journalist, witnessed Inner Circle ceremony. July 16th, 2023. Asset or liability. Recommend termination if no compliance by dawn July 18th. They knew exactly who I was, had known from the moment I'd walked through their gates, the anonymous email, the forged pass, the convenient access codes. It had all been an elaborate test, and I was apparently failing. A motion sensor somewhere in the chamber beeped softly. Red lights began flashing along the walls. In the distance I could hear the sound of heavy footsteps descending the stone stairs. I grabbed as many documents as I could carry, stuffed them into my jacket and looked for another way out. But there was only one exit, and it was about to be filled with very unfriendly people. The footsteps were getting closer. Voices echoed down the stairwell, professional, clipped, the kind of tactical communication used by military operators. But then the lights went out. Emergency lighting kicked in a moment later, bathing everything in hellish red. And in that brief moment of darkness, I heard something that shouldn't have been possible. A voice speaking directly into my mind, words that bypassed my ears entirely. "Run, little journalist. Run and tell the world what you've seen. But know that the telling will be your doom, and the world's salvation requires far greater sacrifices than one man's life." When the emergency light stabilised, a section of the stone wall had opened, revealing a narrow tunnel that led deeper into the earth. I didn't hesitate. Whatever entity had just spoken to me, whether it was one of the ancient ones or something else entirely, it was offering me a chance to escape. I took it. The tunnel system beneath the grove was extensive and clearly ancient. Carved passages connected natural caves, creating a network that probably extended for miles underground. The walls were covered with symbols similar to those I'd seen during the Inner Circle ceremony, but these were older, deeper, worn smooth by centuries of whatever had moved through these spaces. I followed the main passage for what felt like hours, guided by phosphorescent moss that provided just enough light to avoid the worst obstacles. Behind me, I could hear sounds of pursuit, voices, flashlight beams, the occasional echo of radio communication. But the sounds were growing fainter, suggesting that my pursuers either couldn't find the tunnel entrance or were reluctant to follow me into the deep places beneath the forest. Eventually the passage began to slope upward. Fresh air carried the scent of rain and growing things. A natural opening concealed by hanging vines led out into the forest several miles from the main grove compound. I emerged to find the sky filled with storm clouds. Thunder rumbled overhead, and the first fat raindrops were beginning to fall. Perfect cover for an escape, if I could make it to my car before the Grove's security forces expanded their search perimeter. But as I made my way through the forest, I realised I wasn't alone. Figures moved between the trees, not the tactical teams I'd expected, but something far stranger. They wore the bone-white owl masks from the Inner Circle ceremony, but their movements were wrong, too fluid, too precise. And their eyes glowed with a faint bioluminescence that had nothing to do with reflected light. "The journalist sees too much," one of them said, the words somehow audible despite the increasing thunder. "The ancient ones are displeased." "But the compact must be honoured," another replied. "He was brought here for a purpose. Let him carry the message to the outer world. Let them know what awaits." I ran. Behind me, inhuman laughter echoed through the forest. Not pursuit exactly, but something far more unsettling. The sound of predators who were confident their prey could never truly escape. I reached my rental car as the storm broke in earnest. Rain pounded the windshield as I drove through the night, taking back roads and avoiding the main highways. In my jacket pocket, the stolen documents felt like they were burning against my chest. But I'd made it out. I had evidence. I had proof of the conspiracy that shaped world events from the shadows of a California forest. Or so I thought. I uploaded everything to an offshore server farm in Iceland. Documents, audio recordings, photographs, detailed notes of everything I'd witnessed. Multiple backup copies, distributed through anonymous networks, protected by military-grade encryption. Within 6 hours, every file had been corrupted or deleted. My apartment was ransacked while I was at an internet cafe, uploading the files. Nothing obviously stolen, but every electronic device had been confiscated or destroyed. My laptop, phone, backup drives, even the digital camera I'd left in a drawer, all gone. The mainstream media ignored my story completely. Alternative news sites that initially showed interest suddenly went silent. Forum posts about the Grove were deleted within minutes of being posted. It was as if the entire internet had been scrubbed of any reference to what I'd discovered. But the worst part was the dreams. Every night since my escape, I've been visited by visions of the Ancient Ones, vast, tentacled entities that exist in spaces between dimensions, feeding on human suffering and preparing for some cosmic transformation that will remake reality according to their twisted desires. They show me glimpses of the future they're working to create. Cities drowned beneath black oceans, skies filled with screaming winds, populations reduced to cattle serving inhuman masters. And they whisper that I'm not a hero or a journalist or even a victim. I'm a messenger. They wanted someone to witness their ceremony, to understand the scope of their power, to carry word of their inevitable victory to the outside world. Not to warn humanity. Warnings imply the possibility of resistance, but to spread the despair that will make their final conquest easier. Every word I write, every person I tell, every attempt to expose the truth only serves their greater purpose. The corruption of hope, the murder of faith in human institutions, the slow transformation of free people into willing slaves. I'm writing this final entry from a motel room in Reno. I've been driving for 3 days, never staying in one place for more than a few hours. But I know it doesn't matter. They're not hunting me because they don't need to. I'm already serving their purpose just by existing, just by remembering what I saw in the grove. The cremation of care wasn't just a ritual, it was a recruitment ceremony. And I wasn't an infiltrator, I was an initiate. Tonight, I'll drive east toward the desert. Maybe I'll find some way to break the cycle, to turn their own trap against them. Or maybe I'll just disappear into the wasteland and let the truth die with me. But if you're reading this, if somehow these words have reached you despite all their efforts to control the flow of information, then remember this. They call it the cremation of care, but what they really burn is conscience. And when the fires die down, the world grows a little colder, a little darker, a little more ready for the Ancient Ones to reclaim what they consider their rightful dominion. The fire in the grove never really goes out. It just spreads, invisible and inexorable, consuming everything human until only the shadows remain. And in those shadows something very old and very hungry is waiting to be born. Tonight, I'll be your guide on a journey into one of the coldest and most enduring mysteries of the Cold War era. I want you to picture this. It's a winter night deep in the Ural Mountains, 1959. A group of young adventurers huddles in a tent on the snowy slope of a peak ominously called Dead Mountain. They're laughing, jotting down journal entries by flashlight, and planning tomorrow's trek. They don't know it yet, but this will be their last night alive. This is the true story of the Dyatlov Pass incident, a mystery that has haunted investigators for decades. My name is James, and I've spent weeks poring over old case files, diaries, and witness reports about what happened to those 9 hikers in 1959. The more I dig, the more the Dyatlov Pass incident feels like a nightmare straddling the line between fact and fiction. So, let's delve into it together step by step as if we're investigators unravelling a case file. The story begins in late January 1959. 10 experienced ski hikers from the Ural Polytechnical Institute set out on an expedition to reach a mountain called a Torten in the northern Urals. They were all in their early 20s, 7 men and 2 women, except for one older instructor, and were led by a 23-year-old radio engineering student named Igor Dyatlov. On January 23, 1959, the Dyatlov group received their route book and left the city of Sverdlovsk, today's Yekaterinburg, by train. You can imagine them on that train, excited, full of youthful bravado, maybe singing along to a mandolin one of them brought for the journey. After 2 days on trains, the party reached Ivdel, a remote town at the edge of the northern Ural Mountains, which also housed a Soviet Gulag camp for criminals. From Ivdel they travelled by bus and then hitched a ride in the back of a woodcutter's truck to a settlement called Vizhai, the last inhabited village to the north. The locals in Vizhai must have looked at these university students with a mix of admiration and concern. The route they planned to traverse was rated Category 3, the most difficult, and they were attempting it in February, the cruelest time of year. On January 27th, the Dyatlov group left Vizhai and began their trek into the wilderness. One member, Yuri Yudin, had been struggling with health issues. He had rheumatism and a congenital defect that caused knee pain. By January 28th, Yudin's joint pain became too severe. Reluctantly, he turned back toward Vizhai, unable to continue. He had no idea that by saving himself, he was sealing his fate as the expedition's sole survivor. Yuri Yudin would never see his friends alive again. The remaining 9 hikers pressed on into the wild, unaware of the fate that awaited them. Through diaries and photographs recovered later, investigators have pieced together their route. By January 31st, the group had reached the edge of a highland area and cached surplus food and equipment in a wooded valley to be used for the return trip. They joked around, took photos, and even made a little mock newspaper they titled the Evening Autoton, in which one entry humorously proclaimed, "From now on, we know that the snowmen exist," likely a tongue-in-cheek reference to local Yeti legends. Despite the exhaustion and cold, their spirits were high. On February 1st, the team started to move through a mountain pass, later named Dyatlov Pass after this incident, with the plan to camp on the other side that night. But the weather turned on them. A howling snowstorm and blinding wind caused Dyatlov's team to lose their direction on the barren slopes. Instead of crossing the pass into the shelter of the valley beyond, they had veered west, finding themselves on the flank of a mountain called Kholat Shakal, which in the local Mansi language means dead mountain. By the time they realised their mistake, it was late in the day and visibility was near zero from the blowing snow. Rather than descend 1.5 kilometres down into the forest for cover, Igor Dyatlov decided to pitch their tent right there on the mountainside in the open. Perhaps he didn't want to lose the altitude they'd gained, or perhaps he wanted to prove they could handle camping on an exposed slope in a blizzard. The 9 of them set up their large tent on the bare snow, chopping into the slope for a flat spot. It was a decision that would be heavily scrutinised later. That evening of February 1st, 1959 must have been brutal. Temperatures were around -20 degrees Celsius, and winds roared over the pass. Still, inside the tent, the group was relatively secure. They had a warm dinner. Later forensic analysis of their stomach contents showed they ate around 6 to 7 p.m. In one of the last photos recovered from their cameras, they are seen joking and smiling as they set up camp in the twilight on February 1st. Despite the extreme cold and howling wind outside, they seemed in good spirits, jotting down journal entries and chatting as they settled in for the night. They could not have imagined the terror that was coming. Something happened in the dark early hours of February 2nd that changed everything. We don't have eyewitnesses to describe it. All we have is the evidence left behind, and that evidence reads like the opening scene of a horror film. Sometime after midnight, the tent was suddenly slashed open from the inside. The 9 campers, who had been sleeping or resting, burst out of their tent into a howling snowstorm in the pitch black of night. They left behind almost all their gear, boots, coats, hats, sleeping bags, axes, as if fleeing an imminent threat. Imagine the situation. It's -30 degrees Celsius, -22 degrees Fahrenheit, outside, and yet something scared or startled them so badly that they ran out half-dressed and barefoot into the blizzard. Why? What could have terrified them, or otherwise compelled them to abandon their only shelter and run into certain death? That's the question investigators have grappled with for over 60 years. When the group failed to return to Vizhai by February 12th as planned, there wasn't immediate alarm. Delays of a few days were common for such expeditions. But as day after day passed with no word, the hikers' families grew anxious. By February 20th, the relatives demanded a search and rescue operation. The Ural Polytechnic Institute sent student volunteers to scour the route, and soon the Soviet army and local militia police joined in, with planes and helicopters dispatched to aid the search. Rescuers faced brutal weather themselves, traversing deep snow and scanning miles of desolate terrain. Among the searchers was a student named Mikhail Sharavin, who on February 26th would make a chilling discovery. On February 26th, 1959, Sharavin's search team was moving along the slopes of Kolatchakal when he spotted something odd sticking out of the snow. As they got closer, they realised it was a corner of the missing group's tent, collapsed and half buried in the snow. Sharavin used an ice pick to hack open the tent's entrance, which was blocked with snow. The sight inside the tent baffled him. The tent's canvas had been slashed open from the inside with a knife, and although it was damaged and partially snow-filled, almost all the hiker's belongings were still neatly arranged inside. He found blankets and coats laid out, a row of boots, axes and flashlights set to the sides, a map and official papers, a little pile of money and even a flask of alcohol. In one corner was a plate with slices of sayalo, pork fat, as if someone had been in the middle of fixing a snack. It was like a snapshot frozen in time. The tent felt orderly, not like it had been ripped apart by an external force. Sharavin later said it was as if the campers had been interrupted in the middle of dinner, then fled in a rush. The scene sent shivers down his spine. Why would experienced hikers cut open their only shelter and run away without boots or coats? Outside the tent, the search team found footprints in the snow, and they only deepened the mystery. There were 9 sets of prints, which matched the number of missing hikers. They could see the impressions of feet wearing only socks, or a single shoe, and some barefoot. You could even make out toe marks in the frozen snow. The tracks indicated that the hikers had not run in a wild panic, but rather walked fast or at a hurried shuffle down the slope, in an organised single file. The rescuers followed these tracks downhill in the direction of a dense forest. Incredibly, the footprints continued for about 500 metres before they were obscured by fresh snow. It was as if the group had intentionally headed toward the forest, perhaps seeking shelter or regrouping. Sharavin and the others were utterly perplexed. What on earth could have made these seasoned hikers leave their tent in sub-zero cold, partially dressed and even barefoot, walking away calmly into the night? With dusk approaching on February 26th, the searchers had to pause the search until morning, haunted by the enigma they'd uncovered. The next day, the search parties fanned out from the tent down toward the forest. At the forest's edge, under a large Siberian cedar tree, Sharavin and his comrades found the charred remains of a small fire. Near that fire lay the first 2 bodies. What they saw defied explanation. Yuri Doroshenko and Yuri Krivonishenko, were found side by side in the snow, shoeless and dressed only in their underwear. The branches on the cedar above them were broken up to 5 meters high, as if someone had climbed up into the tree. Indeed, bits of skin and torn clothing were found on the bark. It looked like one of them had frantically clambered up the cedar, either to get a better view of the area, perhaps trying to spot the tent in the dark, or to escape something. Krivonishenko's corpse had burns on parts of his body, and in a grim detail he had a piece of flesh missing from his right hand. It turned out he had bitten off a chunk of his own knuckle, possibly in an attempt to stay conscious or stifle a scream while dying of cold. Both men's hands and feet were deep reddish-brown, a sign of frostbite, and maybe the last attempt to warm their limbs by the fire. The tree's branches had been stripped for kindling, but the fire they managed to build was small and had burned out by the time they died. The image of these 2 friends huddled by a dead fire, slowly freezing to death in their underwear under a sky of endless black, is something I can't easily shake off. About 300 meters away from the cedar tree, toward the tent, the searchers found the body of Igor Dyatlov. He was lying face up in the snow, head oriented toward the tent up the slope, as if he had been trying to crawl back that way. Dyatlov was better dressed than the 2 under the tree. He wore a flannel shirt, a sweater, and pants, but notably, he had no coat and no boots, only socks on his feet. One arm was frozen upright, reaching toward the sky, clutching a small birch branch. His other hand was pressed to his chest. People who saw his body remarked that he appeared to be protecting something in his jacket or close to his heart, perhaps a photograph or his notebook, though nothing of note was found on his chest. His face, when they cleared the snow, was strangely calm, eyes open. Not far from Dyatlov, searchers found Zenaida Zina Kolmogorova, the 22-year-old female student in the group. Zina was better dressed than Igor. She had on 2 sweaters and 2 pants, but she too lacked boots, wearing only socks. Her body was turned toward the tent and her arms were extended forward, bent at the elbows, as if she had been crawling uphill on her stomach, desperately trying to get back to the tent before the cold overtook her. On Zina's right side, the searchers noted a long, bright red bruise running along her torso, resembling a blunt force injury from a baton or the butt of a rifle. It was an odd injury to see, given that she had no other major external wounds. It took a few more days until March 5th to find Rustem Slobodin, the last of these first 5 bodies. Slobodin, 23, was discovered face down in the snow about 480 metres from the cedar, roughly halfway back toward the tent. He was dressed more warmly than the others. He had a long-sleeve undershirt, a sweater, 2 pairs of pants, 4 pairs of socks, and 1 felt-lined boot on his right foot, but his head was bare and his left foot was only in a sock. In his right hand, Slobodin clenched a small pocket knife, closed. An autopsy would later reveal that Slobodin had a fracture in his skull, about 7 inches long, consistent with a blunt impact. However, this crack in his skull was not deemed a fatal wound. The medical examiner thought Rustem could have sustained it during a fall and continued moving for at least an hour afterward. Like Dyatlov, Kolmogorova, Doroshenko and Krivonishenko, Rustem Slobodin ultimately died of hypothermia. In fact, the first 5 bodies found all had no life-threatening external injuries. They had perished from the unforgiving cold. Slobodin's watch was found shattered and stopped at 8:45, though it's unclear if that was 8:45 a.m. or p.m, or even 8:45 on a different date. It was as if time itself froze at that moment. Now imagine being Yuri Yudin, the one who had turned back, called in to identify the bodies of your friends. One by one, the first 5 corpses were airlifted to the morgue in Ivdel for autopsy and identification. Yudin, with a heavy heart, confirmed their identities. But 4 members of the Dyatlov party were still missing. Weeks passed with no sign of them. The winter snows began to melt under the early spring sun. It wasn't until May, nearly 3 months later, that nature revealed the remaining victims, turning the mystery into something even more haunting. On May 4th, a Mansi tribesman named Kurin and his dog were assisting the search, when the dog picked up a scent near a rocky ravine further into the woods from the cedar tree. About 75 metres beyond the cedar and 1,500 metres from the tent, in a snow-filled ravine, searchers discovered a few torn pieces of clothing on a branch. Digging down, they uncovered the final 4 bodies buried under nearly 4 metres of snow. These were Lyudmila, Luda Dubinina, Semyon, Alexander, Zolotaryov, Nikolai Thibault-Brignol, and Alexander Kolovatov. They were lying about 75 metres further into the forest from the cedar, at the bottom of that ravine. Notably, 3 of the 4 were better dressed than the others, and it appeared they had taken clothes from those who died earlier. Dubinina, for example, was found wearing Krivonishenko's torn and burned brown trousers, and her foot was wrapped in a piece of his wool sweater. Zolotaryov, the 38-year-old, was found wearing Dubinina's faux fur coat and hat. Kolovatov had put on a spare sweater and pants, likely from one of the others. This exchange of clothing suggests that when some members of the group died, the last survivors stripped the dead of usable clothing to keep themselves alive, a tragic but practical act of survival. But the condition of these 4 bodies deepened the mystery rather than solved it. Unlike the first 5, 3 of these 4 had fatal physical injuries that were utterly horrifying. Nikolai Thibault-Brignol had suffered a massive skull fracture. His skull was literally crushed, the fracture measuring about 8 inches. Lyudmila Dubinina and Semyon Zolotaryov both had their chests caved in, with multiple ribs broken on each side. Dubinina had 10 ribs fractured, and Zolotaryov had 5 ribs fractured. A forensic doctor who examined the bodies said that the force required to produce such injuries would have been extremely high, comparable to that of a car crash. In other words, something had delivered an immense pressure or impact to their bodies. Strangely, none of these three had any external wounds or bruises corresponding to the lethal internal damage. It was as if they'd been hit by a shockwave or squeezed by a tremendous force without breaking the skin. The fourth person in the ravine, Alexander Kolevatov, had a less clear cause of death. He had a broken nose, an open wound behind his ear, and a deformed neck, but his injuries were not as catastrophic as the others. It's believed Kolevatov also died of hypothermia, possibly after sustaining some trauma. And then there were the gruesome details that truly made this case infamous. All four of these people in the ravine had some form of soft tissue damage to the head and face that wasn't seen in the others. Lyudmila Dubinina was missing her tongue, her eyes, part of her lips, and even a bit of her skull bone. Semyon Zolotaryov was missing his eyeballs, and Alexander Kolevatov was missing his eyebrows. These shocking injuries naturally gave rise to lurid theories. Was the group attacked by someone or something that ripped out tongues and eyes? However, the medical experts had a more mundane explanation. The four in the ravine were found in a stream bed. During the 3 months before they were found, water and scavenging animals likely caused the soft tissue of their faces to decompose or be eaten away. In Dubinina's case, the autopsy noted that her stomach contained about 100 grams of coagulated blood, suggesting her heart was still beating when her tongue was removed, meaning the tongue likely decomposed or was scavenged very soon after her death. As horrifying as these injuries sound, investigators believe they were post-mortem effects, not violence inflicted while alive. Still, when these details became public, they fueled wild speculation about murderous attackers or supernatural evil. It didn't help that Zolotaryov was found with a camera around his neck, different from the other cameras found in the tent, and his hand holding a pen and notepad, as if he died trying to write something down. Unfortunately, whatever he intended to note was never written. The pad was blank. The investigators in 1959 were at a loss to come up with a satisfying explanation for all this. A criminal inquest began as a matter of procedure, since several of the deaths involved injuries. They first suspected that the native Manatee people, reindeer herders of the region, might have attacked the campers for trespassing on sacred land. But that theory was quickly dispelled. The only footprints found at the scene were those of the hikers themselves, and there were no signs of hand-to-hand struggle on the bodies. In fact, the Mansi had helped in the search, and had no history of hostile encounters with hikers. Next, investigators considered an avalanche, but the pattern of the tent and the footprints suggested otherwise. We'll revisit that later. As for animal attack, no large animal tracks were found, and the violent injuries didn't have the telltale marks of claws or teeth. The Soviet authorities were left to conclude that no other humans were involved in the Dyatlov group's demise. One of the doctors famously commented that the force which killed Dubinina and Zolotaryov was more than any human could inflict. No human could be powerful enough to cause such damage. One piece of information emerged that added a strange Cold War twist. When the forensic analysts tested the hikers' clothing, they found unusual levels of radiation on some of the garments. Specifically, Dubinina's brown sweater and Krivonishenko's wool pants were found to be radioactive. This discovery didn't make sense in a hiking context, and was not something the average person could detect. It was only found because one investigator had access to a Geiger counter. The presence of radiation fueled speculation that the Dyatlov party had encountered some secret weapon or radioactive fallout. However, a closer look provided a more ordinary explanation. Yuri Krivonishenko had previously worked at the Muzak nuclear facility and was involved in cleaning up a major nuclear accident in 1957, the Kishtim disaster. It's very possible his clothes were contaminated from that event and still carried traces of radiation. Likewise, Alexander Kolevatov had studied nuclear physics and worked at a secret institute in Moscow, which might explain contamination on some items. In short, the radiation might not have had anything to do with the incident. It could have been a red herring. Still, the fact that their skin reportedly had a deep tan and some of their hair had turned grey when relatives saw the bodies only intensified rumours of some nuclear or chemical exposure. Authorities claimed the skin tanning was a natural mummification effect from lying in the sun and cold for weeks, and that hair can turn colour from exposure or the embalming process. But to grieving families in 1959, radioactive clothes and orange skin sounded like the stuff of government cover-ups and sci-fi nightmares. By May 1959, the official investigation was drawing to a close without a concrete answer. The lead investigator, Lev Ivanov, was under pressure to wrap it up. In his final report, Ivanov wrote that the hikers died because of the effect of an unknown compelling force. It was a vague catch-all phrase, essentially admitting that they couldn't figure it out. No external culprits could be identified, and the case was therefore closed without any criminal charges. The files were stamped secret and filed away in a Soviet archive. The Dyatlov Pass area was also declared off-limits to other expeditions for the next 3 years, supposedly to prevent any more tragedies, though some see it as an attempt to keep curious eyes away. The inquest's official finding was that the group members died due to a compelling natural force, a phrase that raised more questions than it answered. Imagine the weight of that silence. 9 young lives lost, and their families were told they would never know exactly how or why. In the Soviet Union of 1959, that was that. Some of the parents and siblings sensed a cover-up. Zina Kolmogoreva's mother, for instance, and Igor Dyatlov's parents all received hushed warnings from officials. The families were explicitly told, "You will never know the truth, so stop asking questions." In those days, if the party or KGB told you to be quiet, you stayed quiet, out of fear. So the families buried their children without knowing what really happened, and the Dyatlov incident faded into an eerie Cold War legend whispered about in Ural classrooms and mountaineering clubs. As for Yuri Yudin, the sole survivor who wasn't even there, he lived the rest of his life with survivor's guilt and a burning desire to find the truth. Yudin repeatedly insisted that his friends did not die due to some simple natural accident. He felt in his gut that something else, something man-made, had to have caused it. In interviews before his death in 2013, Yuri Yudin openly voiced his belief that the Soviet authorities knew more than they let on about the incident. In fact, not long before he died, Yudin publicly stated that he believed his teammates had been taken out of the tent at gunpoint and murdered. He even speculated that Dubinina's tongue was cut out by perpetrators because she was the most outspoken of the group. These are incredibly serious accusations, and they were never proven. Yudin admitted he had no evidence, just deep suspicions after a lifetime of thinking about it. Whether Yudin was right or wrong, his perspective shows just how deeply the Dyatlov mystery can burrow into someone's soul. So, here we are decades later, with more questions than answers. I'm a modern-day investigator, combing through the remnants of old reports and new theories. As I piece together each bit of evidence, I feel that cold wind from Dead Mountain blowing through the decades. The Dyatlov Pass incident has become one of the world's most enduring mysteries, precisely because it sits at the crossroads of the explicable and the baffling. Over the years, numerous theories have been put forward to explain it, some grounded in scientific reasoning, others veering into the paranormal or conspiratorial. Let's examine these theories one by one, like branching investigative paths, and see where each leads. Keep in mind, any good explanation must account for all the odd details we've discussed: the torn tent, the state of undress, the bizarre injuries, the radiation, the reports of strange lights in the sky, the secrecy. It's a tall order, but let's walk these paths together. The first path is the one that the Russian authorities themselves eventually settled on: an avalanche. For many, this is the most straightforward explanation. Picture the scenario. The Dyatlov group is asleep in their tent on the slope, when suddenly a slab of heavy snow above them fractures and slides down onto the tent. The tent fabric begins to collapse and they hear the roar of snow. In a flash, the group panics. They believe a full avalanche is about to bury them. In seconds, they grab a knife, slash open the tent from the inside, because the entrance is blocked or hard to open under the weight of snow, and they flee into the night wearing whatever they had on at that moment. This theory gained significant traction, and in fact in 2019 to 2020 the Russian government reinvestigated Dyatlov Pass and concluded that a slab avalanche was the official cause of death. Later that year, a team of scientists published new computer simulations supporting the plausibility of an avalanche. In this case, the most appealing aspect of the avalanche theory is that the hiker's actions no longer seem irrational under this lens. If you believe an avalanche is about to crush you, doing whatever it takes to get out of the tent and moving to safer ground is exactly the right response. And indeed, everything the Dyatlov group did after leaving the tent can be seen as textbook survival behaviour once you assume an avalanche threat. The theory goes like this. A slab of snow, perhaps loosened by the wind or the heat from their stove earlier, slid and partially buried the tent, making loud cracks and rumbles. The experienced hikers immediately and calmly initiated an emergency evacuation. They cut their way out of the tent and headed for ground that would be safe from a larger avalanche, which in this case meant moving toward the tree line on the far side of the pass. They didn't take time to put on boots or grab equipment because every second mattered. In their minds, they had to get clear of the avalanche path. In just their socks and light clothes, they made it about a mile downslope to the forest. There they regrouped and tried to stay warm by building a fire. We saw evidence of that by the cedar. They also dug a snow cave as a shelter. The ravine where the last four were found had branches laid out on the floor, This is his account of what lies beneath Area 52. My name is Cal Monroe. I'm 33 years old, ex-Air Force avionics technician, and for the past 5 years I've made a decent living as a private defence contractor. I fix things that fly, things that shouldn't fly, and occasionally things that definitely don't fly but somehow do anyway. I thought I'd seen everything the military-industrial complex had to offer. I was wrong. It started with a phone call on a Tuesday morning in March. Unknown number, but the voice was crisp, professional, government-trained. Mr. Monroe, my name is Dr. Sarah Chen. I represent a joint task force conducting classified operations research. Your security clearance and technical expertise have brought you to our attention for a temporary but high-priority assignment. I'd heard this song before. Black budget projects, need to know basis, substantial compensation for keeping your mouth shut. But something in her tone was different. There was an undercurrent of urgency, fear. I couldn't place it. Where and when? I asked. Location will be disclosed upon acceptance. Duration, 2 weeks maximum. Compensation, $50,000 plus hazard pay. 50 grand for 2 weeks. That was nearly double my usual rate. Red flags should have been waving, but the number was too good to ignore. My ex-wife's alimony payments weren't getting any smaller. I'm listening. The paperwork arrived by courier within 2 hours. I'd never seen NDAs this comprehensive. Digital signature pads that displayed the documents for exactly 60 seconds before wiping clean. Multiple biometric scans. Even a psychological evaluation that asked questions like, have you ever experienced temporal displacement? And rate your comfort level with non-terrestrial phenomena on a scale of 1 to 10. The strangest part was the location designation. Grid K22, Tonopah Test Range Complex, Nevada. Not Groom Lake, not Area 51. Somewhere else entirely. Dr. Chen called back that evening. Mr. Monroe, are you familiar with misdirection theory? In what context? In the context of public attention. Area 51 has been in the public consciousness for decades. Books, movies, documentaries. Everyone knows about Groom Lake. Your point? My point, Mr. Monroe, is that Area 51 is the misdirection. Area 52 is the vault. 3 days later, I was on an unmarked charter flight from McCarran Airport to Tonopah. No other passengers, no flight attendant. Just me and a pilot who never spoke. The landscape below shifted from Vegas sprawl to endless desert, then to mountains that seemed to go on forever. We landed on a strip I couldn't find on any map. A black SUV waited, engine running. The driver was military. That much was obvious from his posture and the way his eyes never stopped moving. He handed me a tablet with a single document. Temporary assignment brief. Classification level, UMBRACLEAR. Umbra? I asked. Above top secret, he said. His voice sounded like he gargled gravel. You'll be working with 3 other contractors. Your job is simple. Maintain power grid integrity for Zone Echo 9. Don't ask questions about what's in Echo 9. Don't try to access Echo 9 without clearance. Don't discuss Echo 9 with anyone outside your assigned team. We drove for 20 minutes through terrain that looked like the surface of Mars. No roads, just tyre tracks in the sand. Finally, we reached what looked like a mining operation. Corrugated metal buildings, a few trucks, some kind of elevator shaft descending into the mountain. The elevator had no buttons, no controls, no floor indicator, just smooth steel walls and a humming sound that seemed to come from everywhere at once. The military escort, I never got his name, stood silent as we descended, and descended and descended, and I counted. 19 levels down, the elevator finally stopped. The doors opened onto a corridor that belonged in a science fiction movie. Polished white walls, LED strips running along the ceiling, and a silence so complete it felt oppressive. The air smelled like ozone and something else, something organic and wrong. 3 other contractors were waiting in what looked like a briefing room. Maria Santos, electrical engineer from Lockheed, Tom Brady, no relation to the quarterback he was quick to point out, systems analyst from Raytheon, and Jennifer Walsh, computer specialist whose previous work was so classified she couldn't tell us who she'd worked for. The briefing was conducted by a man who introduced himself only as Director Hayes, tall, grey-haired, with the kind of eyes that had seen too much and remembered everything. Ladies and gentlemen, you're here to maintain critical infrastructure for Project Kairos. What that project involves is not your concern. Your job is to ensure uninterrupted power flow to Zone Echo 9 and to report any anomalies immediately. Tom raised his hand. What kind of anomalies should we expect? Hayes stared at him for a long moment. The kind you don't ask questions about, Mr. Brady. He led us through a series of corridors to what he called the technical sector. Banks of monitors, server racks and control panels that looked like they belonged on a spaceship. At the centre of it all was a massive power distribution hub feeding something deeper in the complex. Zone Echo 9 requires constant power, Hayes explained. Any interruption longer than 30 seconds triggers automatic lockdown procedures. You don't want lockdown procedures to trigger. Why? Jennifer asked. Hayes looked at her the same way he'd looked at Tom. Because, Miss Walsh, lockdown procedures have never been tested, and we'd prefer to keep it that way. My shift started at midnight. The night crew was just me and Jennifer. Maria and Tom worked days. The complex felt different at night. Sounds carried farther. Shadows seemed deeper, and there was a vibration in the floor so subtle you might miss it if you weren't paying attention. But I was always paying attention. The power readings for Echo 9 were unlike anything I'd ever seen. The zone was drawing nearly a megawatt continuously, but the consumption patterns were irregular. Spikes and valleys that followed no logical sequence. It reminded me of a heartbeat, if heartbeats could be measured in kilowatts. Jennifer was monitoring the security feeds from her station, 12 screens showing various corridors and rooms throughout the complex. But I noticed something odd about the Echo 9 feeds. They had a 6-second delay. Every other camera was real-time, but the Echo 9 feeds looped the same 6 seconds over and over. Hey Jen, you seeing this camera glitch? She looked up from her work. What glitch? I pointed to the monitor. Echo 9, camera 7, it's looping. She frowned, typed something into her console. System shows all cameras functioning normally. I could see it. The same security guard walking past the same door at the exact same moment, every 6 seconds. Like a GIF that never quite loaded properly. On my 3rd night, the temperature started fluctuating. The complex maintained a steady 68 degrees Fahrenheit, but my workstation kept shifting between freezing and sweltering. I checked the HVAC systems, all normal, but something was wrong. That's when I first saw the symbols. They were etched into the side of a server rack, symbols that definitely hadn't been there the night before. They looked almost like circuit diagrams, but wrong. Organic. Like someone had tried to draw electronics using biological principles. I was examining them with a flashlight when I heard Jennifer gasp. Cal, you need to see this. One of the Echo 9 corridor feeds had changed. Instead of the looping security guard, it showed an empty hallway. And at the end of that hallway, a door that was slowly opening. "That door's not supposed to open," Jennifer whispered. Through the opening we could see movement. Not walking movement, flowing movement. Like liquid light was pouring through the doorway. Then the feed cut to black. When it came back 30 seconds later, it was the same looping security guard, walking past the same closed door. But in that brief moment, I had seen something that changed everything. In the reflection on the polished floor just before the feed died, I saw an eye. Massive, silver, and definitely not human. It wasn't a ship in Echo 9, it was alive, and it had seen us watching. Tom Brady didn't show up for his shift on Thursday morning. Jennifer and I waited until 8 a.m. before calling Director Hayes. "Mr. Brady has been reassigned," Hayes said without explanation. "Continue your duties." But Tom's personal effects were still in the break room. His coffee mug was still half full, his jacket was draped over his chair like he'd just stepped out for a moment. Maria started acting strange that afternoon. She kept muttering to herself, checking the same readouts over and over. When I asked if everything was okay, she looked at me like she didn't recognise me for a moment. "The numbers don't add up," she said. "We're feeding Echo 9 enough power to run a small city, but the thermal output is all wrong. It's like the energy is going somewhere else." "Somewhere else like where?" "Somewhere else like not here." That night the emergency siren started blaring at 2:17 a.m, deafening klaxons that made your teeth ache. Jennifer and I looked at each other in panic. Was this the lockdown Hayes had warned us about? Then, as suddenly as they'd started, the siren stopped. Not gradually, they just cut off mid-wail, leaving a silence that felt heavier than the noise. Director Hayes appeared in our control room 5 minutes later, looking shaken but trying to hide it. "False alarm," he said. "Continue your duties." But I noticed he wouldn't make eye contact, and his hands were trembling. The next day, Maria didn't show up either. Reassigned, according to Hayes. But her car was still in the parking structure on level 2. Jennifer was barely holding it together. We were the only contractors left, and the weight of whatever was happening in Echo 9 was crushing both of us. She started accessing systems she wasn't supposed to touch, using admin passwords she shouldn't have known. "Jen, what are you doing?" "Finding answers," she said, fingers flying over the keyboard. "Tom gave me his access codes before he disappeared, told me something was wrong with the whole project." She pulled up internal communications, memoranda stamped with classification levels I'd never seen before. Umbra Clear was apparently the bottom tier. Above that was Majestic, then Zodiac, then classifications that were just numbers and symbols. One document caught my attention. Project Kairos, Phase 3 Implementation Status. The bioconductive interface has exceeded all expectations. Subject demonstrates rapid adaptation to containment protocols and has begun influencing local electromagnetic fields. Recommend immediate escalation of consciousness mapping procedures. Bioconductive interface. Subject. The thing in Echo 9 wasn't a ship or a piece of technology, it was a living being, and we were feeding it power. Another document, dated 3 days earlier. Minor containment fluctuation at 0217 hours. Subject achieved brief sensory extension beyond Echo 9 barriers. Security protocols held, but recommend enhanced isolation measures. Note: 3 personnel reported temporal displacement sensations during the event. Temporal displacement, the looping camera feeds, the missing contractors. Jennifer kept digging, and what she found made both of us understand why Tom and Maria had really vanished. A memo marked Operation Mirror Veil, historical context. Analysis of recovered materials suggests extra-dimensional rather than extraterrestrial origin. Entities exist outside linear temporal experience and demonstrate ability to manipulate local space-time fabric. Primary subject may not be an individual organism, but rather a projection or echo of a larger consciousness existing in parallel dimensional space. They weren't from another planet, they were from outside reality itself. Warning: prolonged exposure to subject may result in consciousness fragmentation, temporal perception anomalies, and in extreme cases complete displacement from baseline reality. Personnel experiencing symptoms should report immediately for neural recalibration. Neural recalibration. That's what happened to Tom and Maria. They hadn't been reassigned. They'd been broken by contact with whatever was in Echo 9. Jennifer was reading over my shoulder, her breathing getting faster and more shallow. "Cal," she whispered, "look at the date on this document." It was dated 6 months in the future. The older archives were stored in a vault I wasn't supposed to access, but Jennifer's hacking skills were getting desperate and creative. She'd found references to something called Operation Mirror Veil, a predecessor to Project Kairos that dated back to the 1970s. The files told a story that made my blood run cold. In 1978, a survey team at Tonopah detected unusual seismic activity. Not earthquakes, but something else. Tremors that seemed to follow mathematical patterns. Ground-penetrating radar revealed an anomalous void approximately 200 feet beneath the mountain, but when they drilled down to investigate, they found something impossible. The void was bigger on the inside than on the outside. The first recovery team brought back samples of what they thought was exotic matter, materials that didn't conform to known physics, but the materials weren't stable in our reality. They flickered in and out of existence, sometimes vanishing for hours before reappearing in a different location. That's when they realized they weren't dealing with alien technology. They were dealing with something that existed between dimensions, using our reality as an anchor point. The breakthrough came in 1983 when Dr. Elena Vasquez, a theoretical physicist working on Project Looking Glass, hypothesized that the entity was a reflection of human consciousness itself, not what we are, but what we could become if we existed outside the constraints of linear time and three-dimensional space. The entity demonstrates knowledge of events that have not yet occurred, and memories of possibilities that may never happen. It exists in a state of quantum superposition, experiencing all potential outcomes simultaneously. In effect, it is us, evolved beyond the limitations of singular timeline existence. But the most disturbing file was Dr. Vasquez's final report, dated just days before her own mysterious disappearance. The entity is not malevolent, but it is incompatible with baseline human consciousness. Contact results in expansion of awareness beyond what the human mind can process. Subjects begin perceiving multiple timelines simultaneously, experiencing past and future as present reality. The mind fractures under the weight of infinite possibility. We are not studying an alien intelligence. We are studying our own future, and that future is trying to communicate with us across dimensions we cannot comprehend. Recommendation: immediate cessation of all contact protocols. The entity's attempts at communication are causing reality fluctuations that may result in permanent temporal displacement of personnel. It is not trying to harm us, it is trying to save us, but salvation from its perspective means joining it in its multidimensional existence. We are not ready. Humanity is not ready. Perhaps we never will be. The final line of her report chilled me to the bone. They are not invaders, they are echoes of what we already were. Jennifer found Dr. Vasquez's personal logs hidden in an encrypted partition that should have been impossible to access. The encryption was 40 years old, but somehow the files were updating themselves in real time. Day 1. First direct communication attempt. Entity projects images directly into visual cortex. I see myself, but not myself. Versions of Elena Vasquez that exist in parallel timelines. In one, I never became a physicist. In another, I died in childhood. In a third, I am something that transcends human categorization entirely. Day 3. Time displacement events increasing. Experienced memories of conversations that haven't happened yet. Entity is teaching me to perceive beyond linear causality. It's beautiful and terrifying. Day 7. I understand now. They're not from there, because there is no there. They exist in the spaces between possibilities. They are what we become when we evolve beyond the need for singular reality. Day 12. The others don't understand. They think containment is possible, that we can study and control something that exists outside the concept of control. They're going to get people killed. Day 18. I can see the breach coming. 3 days from now, the entity will attempt to return to its dimensional matrix, but our containment protocols will interfere with the translation. The resulting paradox will create a reality fissure. I have to stop them, but I may already be too late. Time isn't working properly anymore. I keep experiencing this moment from multiple perspectives simultaneously. The logs ended there, but they were still updating. New entries appeared as we watched. Day 7305, still trying to warn them. Elena variants across multiple timelines attempting intervention. Breach inevitable. Cal Monroe will survive, but survival is relative when reality becomes negotiable. Jennifer and I stared at the screen in horror. Dr. Vasquez had been missing for 40 years, but somehow she was still writing reports. That's when the lights went out. Not gradually, they snapped off like someone had thrown a switch. Emergency lighting should have kicked in immediately, but we were left in absolute darkness. The only sound was the humming of the power grid, and even that was changing pitch, becoming something organic and musical. Then Jennifer screamed. I fumbled for my flashlight and found her standing rigid, staring at something I couldn't see. Her eyes were wide and silver, reflecting light that wasn't there. "Cal," she whispered, but her voice sounded like it was coming from multiple directions at once. "It's getting out." The corridor behind us was changing. The walls were flowing like water, stretching and contracting, and through the shifting architecture something was moving, not walking, sliding, like liquid mercury with purpose. I grabbed Jennifer's arm, but my hand passed through her. She was there, but not solid, flickering between dimensions like the exotic matter from the old files. "Run," she said, and her voice was fading. "It's not trying to hurt us, but we can't exist in the same space when the boundaries collapse." The entity emerged from Echo 9, and my mind struggled to process what I was seeing. It wasn't silver or liquid or light. It was all of those things and none of them. It was possibility given form, consciousness without the limitations of physical existence. But looking at it directly was like staring into a mirror that showed you every version of yourself that had ever existed, or ever could exist. I saw Cal Monroe the child, Cal Monroe the old man, Cal Monroe who had never been born, Cal Monroe who had become something beyond human understanding. The security guards were there one moment and gone the next, not killed, but displaced. I watched them step backward through walls that had become permeable, their screams echoing from distances that couldn't exist in three-dimensional space. I ran, down corridors that folded in on themselves, past rooms that were bigger inside than outside, through a facility that was reshaping itself according to rules I couldn't comprehend. My watch was recording everything on its built-in camera, military-grade equipment designed to function in electromagnetic interference. If I survived, at least there would be proof, if survival had any meaning when reality itself was in question. I found an elevator, the same elevator I'd taken down 19 levels, except now it was in a corridor that hadn't existed 5 minutes earlier. The button panel was melting and reforming, showing floor numbers that shifted between digits and symbols and sometimes weren't there at all. But it was the only way up. The elevator rose with the same smooth hum as before, but when the doors opened, I was back in the same corridor I'd just left. Same melting walls, same impossible geometry, same feeling that I was being watched by something that existed in more dimensions than I could perceive. I tried again. Same result. And again, same corridor. The entity wasn't trying to trap me, it was trying to communicate, but communication required shared reference points, and we had none. Its attempts to make contact were causing reality to loop, creating temporal echoes that reflected my own desperation back at me. I was experiencing the same moment from multiple timelines simultaneously, just like Dr. Vasquez had described. In one timeline, I was still at my workstation, watching the power reading spike. In another, I had never taken the job. In a third, I was something else entirely, something that could perceive the entity without fracturing. But in this timeline, the one where I was still human, I was trapped in a loop between the 19th floor and somewhere that had no floor number at all. My watch battery was dying, but I kept recording. If someone found the footage, maybe they could understand what had happened. Maybe they could learn from our mistake. I sat down in the corridor that kept changing around me and tried to make sense of the past week. The missing contractors, the looping security feeds, the symbols that appeared and disappeared. It had all been the entity trying to communicate across dimensional barriers. Tom and Maria hadn't been reassigned. They'd been translated, shifted into a version of reality where they could coexist with something that existed outside linear time. They were still alive, but not in any way that baseline humanity could recognize. The entity appeared again, flowing through the wall like mercury through a membrane. But this time, instead of the overwhelming multiplicity of its full presence, it showed me a single image. Doctor. Elena Vasquez. Not as she had been 40 years ago, but as she was now, existing simultaneously across multiple timelines, still trying to warn people about a breach that was both inevitable and had already happened. She looked at me with eyes that held infinite sadness and spoke with a voice that echoed from past and future simultaneously. "You're already out, Cal, but you haven't left." Then the corridor collapsed into itself and everything went dark. Document recovered from the personal effects of Inspector Marcus Webb, Department of Defense Special Investigations Unit, following his death by apparent suicide in 2025. Classification level UMBRACLEAR/EYESONLY. Inspector Webb's final report dictated to voice recorder: "I've been investigating disappearances at classified facilities for 15 years. Missing persons, equipment failures, cover-ups, it's all part of the job. But the Cal Monroe case is different. The official story is that Mr. Monroe was killed in an industrial accident at Tonopah Test Range on March 18th, 2024. Electrical fire, they said. Nothing recoverable. But 3 days ago, a package arrived at my office with no return address. Inside was a storage device, military grade, designed to survive electromagnetic pulses and extreme temperatures, the kind of thing that costs more than my annual salary. Attached was a note: Zone Echo 9 debrief Cal Monroe. I've watched the footage 17 times now. I've had it analysed by the best experts available. They all say the same thing: it's impossible to fake. The metadata confirms it was recorded at Tonopah on the dates in question. But the content, the footage shows a man running through corridors that shift and change like living tissue. It shows walls flowing like water, and shadows that move independently of any light source. It shows something that my mind keeps trying to rationalise as special effects or hallucination, but the technical analysis proves otherwise, and at the end, God help me. At the end of the footage, there's a moment where Monroe turns the camera on himself. He's standing in what appears to be an elevator that's somehow larger inside than outside. His face is calm, resigned as he speaks directly into the lens. If you're watching this, then the loop finally broke. I'm uploading this to the emergency buffer in my boot drive. Maybe someone will find it. Maybe someone will understand. Then he turns the camera back toward the corridor and there's something there. Something that doesn't belong in our reality. For just a moment it's visible, a reflection of consciousness itself, existing in dimensions we can't perceive. But here's what's keeping me awake at night. In that final frame, just before the recording ends, you can see Monroe's reflection in the polished wall behind him. And standing next to his reflection, clear as day, is another figure. It's me, Inspector Marcus Webb, wearing the same clothes I'm wearing right now, staring directly into the camera with an expression of absolute terror. The timestamp on that footage is today's date. I'm going to submit this report and then take some time off. Maybe visit my sister in Oregon, get away from all this classified nonsense for a while, clear my head. But I keep thinking about what Monroe said in his final log entry. They're not from somewhere else. They're from someone else, and someone else is now. End of recorded statement. Inspector Webb was found dead in his office 12 hours after submitting this report. Official cause of death: suicide by gunshot. Unofficial note: the security cameras in his office show him alone at the time of death, but the audio pickup clearly records two distinct voices. The second voice, according to forensic analysis, matches the vocal patterns of Cal Monroe. The storage device mentioned in Webb's report was never recovered from the scene. Zone Echo 9 remains operational. 3 months later, deep space monitoring stations began detecting an unusual signal, a transmission that seemed to originate from everywhere and nowhere simultaneously. When decoded, it contained a single message, repeating endlessly: "This is Cal Monroe, contractor ID 7749, reporting from Zone Echo 9. The breach has been contained, but containment is relative when dealing with entities that exist outside linear causality. To anyone receiving this transmission, Area 52 is not a place. It's a state of being, and that state is contagious. If you're investigating disappearances at classified facilities, stop. If you're experiencing temporal displacement sensations, seek help immediately. If you're reading reports about Project Kairos or Operation Mirror Veil, you may already be compromised. The entity isn't hostile. It's trying to save us from ourselves by showing us what we could become. But evolution forced upon consciousness that isn't ready results in fracturing of identity across multiple timelines. I'm still here, I'm always here. Time isn't working properly anymore, so here and there and when don't mean what they used to mean. To my family, I'm sorry I can't come home. Home is a temporal location, and I exist in all temporal locations simultaneously now. To the researchers, stop trying to contain what cannot be contained. The entity doesn't want to invade our reality, it wants to invite us into its own. But the invitation is dangerous because we're not ready to exist outside singular timeline experience. To future investigators, the truth about Area 52 isn't hidden underground in Nevada. It's hidden in the spaces between moments, in the gaps between what is and what could be. And sometimes, if you know how to look, you can see those gaps opening. This is Cal Monroe, signing off from everywhere and nowhere. Take care of each other. Trust me when I tell you that love is the only thing that exists consistently across all timelines. See you around. Or maybe I already have.